Hi folks, Matt Eaton here, Scholar Gladiator. Now, something I get asked about relatively often actually is the use of two Gladii, or Gladius is, together. In particular, this refers to the Dimachorus style or class of gladiator, which I'll talk about a bit more in a second. Now, first thing we should say is the Gladius is a weapon which is utterly designed and suited and specialised to using in conjunction with a really big shield, with the scutum. It's a short sword, okay? We know that in the period in which this was used, people using smaller shields or fighting in different styles tended to use a longer blade. So if you are relying more on the sword for defense and maybe reach, then clearly a longer blade is better. And we know that in the late Roman period, the Romans made greater use of the sparta, for example, which is essentially a precursor of the Germanic one-handed sword as we see in the migration era that leads on to kind of Viking, Anglo-Saxon, Frankish era swords. So a short sword like this is really meant to be used in conjunction with a freaking big shield, with the scutum. And actually a lot of people talk about, as I mentioned in previous videos, talk about this being the weapon that conquered the Roman Empire, that, you know, kind of won the empire for Rome. And it wasn't really, it was many other things. It was their discipline, it was their training, it was their tactics, and it was the scutum as well. So if we look at Roman equipment right the way through the Roman era, the large boss-gripped shield is really the most important and universal piece of equipment that they use all the way through, and used in conjunction, it has to be said, with quite, for the period, quite advanced types of helmet and body armour. So they were heavily armoured and had large shields. Having body armour and good helmets and large shields like the scutum in its various forms and shapes and sizes means that using a short sword becomes practical. If you're not using a shield, a short sword is not really the best thing to be using unless you've got some particular reason for having a short sword. For example, it's a backup weapon and you want something that's easy to wear, or you're fighting in woodland or jungle areas where you can't carry a longer bladed sword around, things like this. Generally speaking, if armour is not involved, if shields are not involved, then a longer blade is always an advantage. And even if shields and armour are involved, longer blades can be an advantage as well. So it's a short sword. Not particularly advantageous by itself, but when paired up in a group of fighting people with a large scutum, very advantageous. So, does it make sense to be using two of these together? Well, to a large part, you were expecting me to say no, it doesn't make any sense at all. Well, actually, no, I wasn't going to say that. It doesn't matter, because the only evidence that we have from the Roman era for two swords being used together is a certain class of gladiator that some people debate was even a class of gladiator. But anyway, it's generally known as the Dimachorus, which actually means pair of knives or two knives. Now, these aren't knives. Let's talk about that for a second. So what we do and don't know about the Dimachorus. So the Dimachorus definitely existed, but they seem to have been very rare. They weren't a major class of gladiator. They possibly weren't even a class of gladiator at all. They were quite probably an almost sort of gimmick that was occasionally brought out for a bit of variety. Possibly they were a subclass of the Murmillo or something like that. We don't really know. Equally, we don't really know what they were usually equipped with. So we know the name means pair of knives, and we know that there's debatably one image from art that shows one with a pair of knives, although some people argue that one of those is actually the weapon of the fallen person that has been disarmed from them, taken away from them, which I think is probably correct actually. So the actual evidence for these Dimachorus, despite the fact that we know that they existed, rarely, but we know that they did exist in some form, the actual evidence for them and what we know about them is absolutely minimal. Did they use a pair of Gladii? Did they use a pair of these? We don't know. Quite possibly not. It's quite possible there's some evidence that they used a sica in each hand, which is the sickle sword, the curved sword, used by the Thracian gladiator. It's possible that they were a subclass of the Thracian who had a pair of sica instead of a pair of gladius. It's possible that they did have a pair of gladii, or it's possible they had one gladius and one sica. We don't really know, and that's the problem. Now, despite that, Hollywood and things like Spartacus and even Gladiator love to have people using a pair of these gladius type swords together. Why? Because it looks good on screen. It's not actually a very effective form of fighting if the opponents are using large shields and spears and things like this. For a start, on the battlefield it doesn't make very much sense because I've got basically no protection now. So one of the main reasons that shields are carried so much throughout history is shields are incredibly effective, not just against the person you're fighting against, who very often is going to have a spear, and it's much easier to defend against a spear if you have a big shield rather than trying to defend against a spear just with parrying, okay, active kind of defense of the spear. You can just stick a large shield in the way. That's the best way of dealing with a spear. But additionally, missile weapons. So in skirmishing or in warfare, anybody could shoot or throw anything at me from any direction at any time. If I'm carrying a large shield which covers most of my body, or at least half of my body, then that's a pretty good defense. Armor adds to that, of course. Just having a pair of swords and no armor and no shield means that anybody throwing anything at me, slinging a sling stone, throwing a spear, throwing a knife, throwing their sword, anything, can hit me if I don't see it coming. And even if I do see it coming, my chances of dodging or hitting it out of the way are somewhat limited. That being said, we know that some cultures did use paired swords. If we look at Thailand, you know, if we look at certain Southeast Asian countries, if we look at even Japan, where the katana was sometimes paired up with the wakizashi, and occasionally, it has to be said, in Europe, particularly in Renaissance Europe, although certainly in Europe, the paired swords tend to have been more a thing of the fencing school rather than the battlefield, for all the aforementioned reasons, probably. So generally speaking, the paired gladius would not be something you'd see on a Roman battlefield ever or at all, okay? In terms of gladiatorial combat, well, that's a different thing because you've got to think about the motivations and the reasons for gladiatorial combat. It's an entertainment. So sometimes people get bored of seeing the typical, you know, the secutor, the murmillo, the rotarius, the hoplomachus, seeing all of the normal types of gladiator, and sometimes they want to see something different. So sometimes they'd pull out someone, oh, look, it's a Thracian with pair of swords, and we'll call them a Dimachorus. That's just guessing, but that's the sort of thing that maybe happened. The Dimachorus probably was a bit of a gimmick, wasn't very popular, possibly because they weren't super effective, but they nevertheless were interesting and fun. And maybe you'd take a very skilled fighter and give them two swords and put them against a less skilled fighter with a more conventional weapon set like a murmillo. So, were a pair of gladii used together? Generally speaking, no. With the one exception of one type of gladiator who was possibly in their own right an exception, and we don't even know if they used a pair of gladii. They may have used a pair of sica or a gladius and a sica. We just don't know. So there we go, paired gladius, gladii used together, not really a thing. Thanks for watching. Give me a subscribe if you're not subscribed already, and a like, and I'll see you really soon again for another video. Cheers, folks. Thanks for watching. We've got extra videos on Patreon. Please give our Facebook a like and subscribe if you haven't already. Cheers, folks.